Andrea Wilson walked into the crowded courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, a moment of hesitation, but she quickly composed herself and walked to the front with quiet confidence. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Her dark skin stood out against the sea of white faces in the room, her presence undeniable, but the momentary attention didn't faze her. She had been in courtrooms like this many times before. She wasn't just any lawyer, she was a force in the legal community, a woman who had worked tirelessly to overcome the challenges that came with being both black and female in a profession still dominated by white men. Andrea had earned her place at the table, but today she wasn't here to make waves. She was here for a simple motion hearing, no more, no less. Judge David Mitchell sat at the bench, a stern expression on his face. His reputation for being strict and unyielding was well known throughout the courthouse. He glanced at his watch when Andrea entered, a subtle but deliberate gesture of disapproval. The room was filled with an air of expectation, as if everyone was waiting to see how the judge would handle the situation. "Late again, Miss Wilson." The judge's voice rang out across the room, cold and sharp. He didn't bother to look up from his paperwork. "This is becoming a pattern, you know the rules." Andrea remained standing, her back straight, her eyes fixed firmly on the judge. She didn't flinch, she didn't apologize, she knew the rules. But she also knew when they were being used to make an example of her, as if her every move was under scrutiny simply because of who she was. "I'm aware of the rules, Your Honor," Andrea responded evenly, her voice calm but firm. She refused to let him see her discomfort or the flash of frustration that stirred beneath her composed exterior. She had a valid reason for being late, but she wasn't about to explain herself to him, not here and not now. Judge Mitchell didn't wait for any more responses. He leaned forward and slammed his gavel down with authority. "I'm fining you $500, Miss Wilson, for being late." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Andrea felt the sting, but only for a moment. Her face remained neutral. A fine was arbitrary at best, but she knew better than to argue in front of an audience like this. She had seen judges do worse to people like her who dared to question their authority. She nodded once more to the judge and turned to leave the courtroom. The fine wasn't the issue here. It was the principle behind it, the unfairness of it, the feeling that being late as a black woman in this space somehow warranted punishment more severe than the same mistake from someone else. As she walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs from the other attorneys and spectators filled the air. But Andrea didn't care. She had a meeting to get to, a plan to execute. The world outside this courtroom was bigger than one small injustice, and Andrea had spent too long working toward change to let something like this define her. Yet even as she stepped outside into the bustling street, she couldn't shake the feeling that today had marked the beginning of something much bigger than just a fine, something she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. Andrea had long since learned to navigate spaces where her presence was a rarity, where her intelligence and success were often overlooked simply because of her race and gender. She had fought for every victory, earning respect with each legal battle she won, each barrier she broke down. Being president of the State Bar Association was a significant achievement for someone like her, a black woman in a system where women of color were often sidelined. Yet, she had always kept that part of her life out of the public eye, focusing instead on her work, quietly pushing for reform and equality in the legal field. Today, however, was different. When Andrea walked out of the courthouse, she couldn't shake the strange sense that something had changed, a feeling that the fine wasn't just a minor inconvenience, but a catalyst for something more. The judge's actions, harsh and unwarranted, had pricked at something deeper, something she had kept hidden even from herself. In a moment of clarity, she realized that the judge's decision wasn't just about tardiness. It was about power, control, and the assumption that she was just another woman to be dismissed. Back in her office, Andrea leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Her legal team had heard about the incident by now, and the conversation had begun. A colleague, Michael, who worked alongside her on several diversity initiatives, had texted her to ask if she was okay. She smiled at the message, but knew the answer wasn't simple. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she put into words that a man who had never once thought twice about the women and men who stood before him had tried to undermine her, not knowing she was the one leading efforts to change the very system he represented. Michael had no idea who Andrea really was. None of her colleagues did, not outside of their professional relationships. Few knew that she was not only a brilliant attorney, but also someone who had taken on one of the most powerful positions in the state's legal community. She had chosen to keep her leadership role discreet, not wanting to be seen as a symbol or token, but rather as a true advocate for equality. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pushing for more inclusive practices within the legal profession. But this fine had shaken her. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the subtle way she had been belittled, as if her role in the legal world didn't matter. Yet, Andrea knew that if she let it slide, she would be allowing others to think it was okay, allowing others to believe that it was acceptable to dismiss people like her. It wasn't just about this fine. It was about every woman of color who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or punished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She stood up, her gaze fixed on the skyline outside her office window. This wasn't the moment to back down. This was the moment to lead, not from behind the scenes, but at the forefront. With resolve hardening within her, Andrea made her decision. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. It was time to show Judge Mitchell and everyone else that she was more than just a name on a case file. She was a leader, and she wouldn't be silenced. Her hand moved toward the phone, dialing her legal team. "We're filing a complaint," she said, her voice steady and determined. "We're not going to let this one slide." The decision to file a formal complaint wasn't an easy one for Andrea. She knew the consequences of going public with this incident could spiral beyond her control. There would be those who questioned her motives, those who accused her of making a mountain out of a molehill. But in that moment, she understood that the fine wasn't just about her. It was a larger symbol of how systemic biases could quietly undermine the progress that had been made. Andrea knew exactly how the legal world worked, how power played a role in every interaction. It wasn't the first time she had encountered subtle discrimination, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it felt different. This time, the subtlety wasn't going to be swept under the rug. She needed to hold Judge Mitchell accountable, not just for this single action, but for the precedent it set. Her legal team, a group of sharp, dedicated lawyers, was already on board. Michael, who had been a close friend and ally throughout her career, took the lead in drafting the complaint. He had seen the way Andrea had been treated in the courtroom, her professionalism ignored, her competence questioned by the sheer fact of her being a black woman in a predominantly white and male profession. Michael, himself a respected attorney, knew the implications of Andrea's decision. This wasn't just a fine. This was a message that the legal community had to hear. The complaint was filed, and soon enough, the ripples began to spread. A story that began in a small courthouse now had the potential to shake the foundations of the legal system. News outlets picked up the story, some framing it as an isolated incident, others questioning whether the judge's actions were racially motivated. The conversation quickly turned from Andrea's fine to the larger question of whether judges were enforcing the law impartially or using their power to reinforce personal biases. Andrea's name, once known only to a few inside the legal community, was now being discussed in living rooms across the state. The fact that she was the president of the State Bar Association, a leader in the fight for legal reform, added weight to her words. People were listening. The legal community was divided. Some lawyers rallied around Andrea, praising her for standing up against an unjust decision. They saw her as a symbol of resilience, an example of the progress they hoped to achieve within the legal profession. Others, however, were quick to criticize her actions. They labeled her complaint as unnecessary, as a distraction from the real issues. Some even accused her of seeking attention. Andrea expected this kind of backlash. In many ways, it was par for the course when someone dared to challenge the status quo. But what struck her most was how quickly the conversation had expanded beyond the courtroom. The community was talking about power, fairness, and race, the subtle ways that injustice could creep into the very institutions meant to uphold it. Andrea knew that this complaint, this seemingly small incident, had triggered something much larger than herself. As the media frenzy grew, Andrea found herself grappling with the attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Her work had always been about the collective, about elevating voices that had been silenced for too long. But now her name was at the center of a storm, and she had no choice but to navigate it with grace. What she did next would determine not just her future, but the future of countless others who had been pushed to the margins. She knew it wasn't just about righting the wrong done to her. It was about changing the system. And for that, Andrea was ready to fight. In the quiet of her office, Andrea paced back and forth, her mind racing with thoughts she hadn't fully processed. The decision to take a stand had been made, but now the weight of it began to settle in. The complaint against Judge Mitchell wasn't just a reaction to being wronged. It was a challenge to a system she had spent her entire career trying to reform from the inside. She was no stranger to resistance, to being underestimated, but now the stakes felt higher. It wasn't just about her reputation as an attorney or even as the president of the State Bar Association. It was about every person who had ever felt the sting of discrimination in the very places they sought justice. She had fought so hard to be where she was, climbing up through the ranks of a legal world that often dismissed her. Andrea had worked with her mentors, forged connections with colleagues, and most importantly, had earned the respect of her peers, not by simply playing the game but by rewriting the rules in her own way. Yet every time she stepped into a courtroom, she was reminded that it wasn't enough to just be good at her job. There was always the lingering doubt about whether she had truly earned her place, or whether it was a concession made because of her position, because of her fight for diversity and inclusion. The fine, in its quiet injustice, had cut deeper than she had expected. It wasn't just a matter of a few $100s. It was a reminder that even in her position of power, she was still vulnerable to the biases that shaped the legal system. It was the small things, the looks, the comments, the dismissive actions that accumulated over time, leaving a mark that could never be fully erased. Andrea had fought for recognition, but this fine reminded her that even recognition could be hollow in spaces where the rules were still rigged. As the days passed, she found herself thinking about the women, the people of color, the underrepresented voices who walked into that same courtroom and faced the same biases. She wasn't the first person to be subjected to unfair treatment, and she wouldn't be the last. But if she let this go, if she stayed silent, what kind of message would that send to the very people she had worked so hard to support? In her heart, Andrea knew this wasn't just about a personal wrong. It was about something much bigger. She could already hear the whispers of those who would call her complaint petty, unnecessary, or even self-serving. They would accuse her of making mountains out of molehills, of being too sensitive, of playing the race card. But Andrea wasn't in this for herself. She had a platform, yes, but more than that, she had a responsibility to use it for the greater good. One evening, as the sun began to set behind her office window, Andrea sat down with her team to discuss the next steps. Michael, who had been her ally throughout this process, had already gathered some support from fellow lawyers who were eager to join the cause. The complaint had started to gain attention, and the more people who rallied behind it, the more pressure it put on Judge Mitchell. But Andrea wasn't sure if that was enough. She needed more. She needed to make sure that this wasn't just about the fine. It needed to become a conversation about bias in the courts, about how easy it was for some to exercise power and for others to be overlooked, dismissed, or punished for reasons beyond their control. "I'm not just fighting for me," Andrea said to the group, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "I'm fighting for every person who has ever been told they weren't good enough, for every lawyer of color who has been passed over for promotions, for every client who has walked into a courtroom and wondered if they were going to be treated fairly. This isn't just about one fine. This is about changing the way the system works." Her team nodded in agreement. Andrea knew that by taking this step, she was not just challenging a judge's decision. She was challenging a system that had allowed such actions to happen unchecked for too long. and despite the risk, she knew she had no choice but to see it through. The battle wasn't just about the fine. It was about justice itself. The formal complaint had been filed, and in the days that followed, the consequences of Andrea's decision began to unfold. The legal community, long accustomed to being insular and protective of its own, was now forced to confront the question Andrea had posed. Was the judiciary system truly impartial, or had personal biases slipped into its very foundations? As the story gained traction, the ripple effect was impossible to ignore. What had initially seemed like a simple issue, an attorney being fined for tardiness, had morphed into a public discourse on power, privilege, and the subtle forces that shaped every courtroom encounter. Andrea's phone began to buzz incessantly with messages of support from fellow lawyers, activists, and colleagues in the legal profession. Some were well-meaning friends who had watched her rise through the ranks. Others were people she didn't even know, reaching out to say they had experienced similar biases. One text from a younger black lawyer in a neighboring state struck her deeply. "Thank you for standing up for us," the message read. "You don't know how much this means." But even with the outpouring of support, Andrea could sense the tension building. Those who opposed her efforts, many of whom were influential figures in the state's legal and political circles, were not about to let her challenge slide without retaliation. Whisper campaigns began to circulate, questioning her motivations. Some argued she was seeking personal gain. Others claimed she was using her position to create unnecessary division within the legal community. And of course, there were those who simply didn't want to acknowledge that such biases existed at all. In many ways, Andrea had braced herself for this kind of pushback. She had seen it countless times before. When a person of color raised their voice about unfair treatment, the response was often to discredit or diminish their experience. But this time, the stakes felt higher. She wasn't just an individual attorney. She was the president of the State Bar Association. Her role demanded a standard of fairness and integrity that went beyond her personal case. She had a responsibility to her community, and she was determined to see this through, no matter the obstacles. The media, too, had picked up on the growing tension. Headlines began to shift from just reporting on the fine to asking deeper questions about Judge Mitchell's history on the bench. Was this fine a simple mistake, or was it part of a larger pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed? Investigative journalists began to look into the judge's rulings in previous cases, particularly those involving people of color. Andrea knew this scrutiny could turn the spotlight back onto the very institution she had worked so hard to reform, but she also understood that shining that light was necessary. The more the story gained momentum, the more Andrea felt the pressure building. She had to maintain her composure in a world that seemed to be watching her every move. If she faltered, if she let her emotions get the better of her, she knew the critics would pounce. And yet, despite the weight of everything on her shoulders, Andrea remained resolute. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had been overlooked or dismissed in a system that was supposed to protect them. In a private moment of reflection, Andrea realized just how far she had come. She had built her career from the ground up, always believing in the possibility of change, in the power of one voice to create a ripple effect. But now, standing at the center of a storm, she realized that this wasn't just about challenging one fine. It was about redefining the very standards of justice, about ensuring that the systems of power, whether in the courtroom or beyond, were held accountable. The fight had only just begun, and Andrea was more determined than ever to see it through. The next few weeks were a blur of media appearances, legal meetings, and intense scrutiny. The story of Andrea Wilson's fine had moved from a local issue to a statewide conversation, with ripple effects stretching beyond the borders of her state. News outlets, both local and national, began covering the controversy from every angle. Legal experts debated whether the judge's actions were part of a larger pattern of racial discrimination in the judicial system. Some called for an independent investigation into Judge Mitchell's history on the bench. Others, especially those sympathetic to the judge's conservative reputation, claimed Andrea's challenge was nothing more than a public stunt. Andrea had anticipated the backlash, but the level of hostility she was facing was more than she had expected. Despite the outpouring of support from progressive allies and other people of color in the legal field, there were those in positions of power who sought to discredit her at every turn. She had seen the way the system worked, how those who challenged its biases were often silenced, smeared, or ignored. One particularly difficult moment came when a senior member of the state bar, someone Andrea had worked with closely for years, privately told her that she had overreacted. The implication was clear. Her decision to challenge the fine was an embarrassment to the Bar Association, a divisive move that would only undermine the progress they had made. Andrea was hurt by the conversation, especially from someone she had considered a mentor. But the words also hardened her resolve. She wasn't fighting for their approval. She was fighting for something much bigger. She was fighting for the future of the profession, for the countless lawyers who had faced the same subtle discrimination she had, and for the clients who had been denied justice because of an unjust system. Despite the pressure, Andrea continued to meet with her legal team, strategizing the next steps. Michael, who had become her closest ally during the ordeal, remained a steady presence, constantly reassuring her when the weight of the fight threatened to become overwhelming. "We're on the right side of history," he would say, and she believed him. But Andrea knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. The legal community was entrenched, and even the smallest cracks in its foundation would be fiercely guarded. Then, just as things seemed to reach a fever pitch, a breakthrough came. A former law clerk who had worked under Judge Mitchell reached out to Andrea. The clerk had left the judicial system years ago, disillusioned by what they had witnessed during their time in the courtroom. The clerk revealed that they had seen firsthand how Judge Mitchell routinely displayed biased behavior toward people of color and women, particularly in cases involving high-profile civil rights issues. The clerk had compiled a list of troubling instances, some of which had been documented in case files, but never addressed. Andrea immediately brought this information to her legal team. It was the missing piece, the evidence that could change everything. They knew that this was more than just an opportunity to challenge one judge. It was a chance to expose a pattern of injustice and possibly open the door for broader systemic change. But Andrea also knew that revealing this information would not be without its risks. Exposing Judge Mitchell's behavior could create a backlash that would extend far beyond the courtroom. She had already seen how people with power in the legal community reacted to threats to their status quo. But with the support of her team and the weight of the evidence, Andrea felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her own justice anymore. She was fighting for a change that could impact generations of lawyers and clients to come. As the pressure mounted, Andrea found herself at a crossroads. Continue down the path she had started, with all its risks and challenges, or back down and allow the system to remain as it was. But for Andrea, there was no question. She had come too far to turn back now. The fight was no longer about one fine or one judge. It was about ensuring that justice, in every form, was truly equal for all. The moment Andrea received the confidential information from the former law clerk, she knew that the stakes had just gotten much higher. This was no longer just about her being unfairly fined in a courtroom. It was about shining a light on the systemic discrimination that ran deeper than she could have imagined. With this new evidence, Andrea was no longer fighting just for justice in her own case. She was fighting to expose a toxic undercurrent that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for years. The legal community was already divided, but with the new revelations, the narrative was shifting. Andrea and her team decided to go public with the information. They arranged for a press conference, knowing that the exposure would make waves. The former law clerk, whose identity remained anonymous for safety reasons, had detailed several troubling incidents that spoke to a pattern of biased rulings, inappropriate comments, and a lack of professional decorum from Judge Mitchell. The clerk's testimony, corroborated by case files and court records, painted a picture of a judge who had consistently favored certain demographics while ignoring the rights of others, particularly people of color and women. As Andrea prepared for the press conference, she was overwhelmed with the gravity of the moment. She had known that she was up against powerful forces, but now, the story was growing beyond just the legal community. The media had already picked up the story, and the pressure was mounting. Reporters from major networks were eager to get the first interview, and social media was ablaze with debates over Judge Mitchell's conduct and Andrea's decision to expose it. The night before the press conference, Andrea couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing with what-ifs. What if the backlash was too much to handle? What if the public didn't believe the clerk's testimony? What if the risks of going public outweighed the potential benefits? In the quiet of her office, surrounded by the familiar files and legal texts, Andrea realized that there was no turning back. The moment she filed that complaint against the judge, she had already stepped into a battle that would define her legacy. The next day, standing before the cameras with her legal team at her side, Andrea spoke with the calm authority she had honed over years of being underestimated. She didn't allow herself to show the nerves that twisted inside her. This was bigger than her personal discomfort. This was about holding the system accountable. Today, we are not just speaking about a single fine or a single individual. Andrea began, her voice steady, her eyes focused. We are speaking about a larger issue that has been ignored for far too long. A judge who has allowed personal biases to influence his decisions, and in doing so, has failed the very people he is sworn to serve. It is not just my fight. It is the fight of every person who has ever walked into a courtroom and felt that their voice didn't matter. The room was silent as Andrea's words hung in the air. She continued, revealing the former clerk's testimony and laying out the evidence that supported it. The faces in the room shifted as the reality of what Andrea was presenting began to sink in. This was not an isolated incident. This was a systemic issue. The fallout was immediate. Legal commentators on television debated the implications of Andrea's actions. Some praised her for her courage and commitment to justice, while others criticized her for potentially jeopardizing the reputation of the entire legal system. Social media buzzed with opinions, and soon, the hashtag #JusticeForAndrea began trending, with people from all walks of life expressing their support for the lawyer who had dared to expose the truth. In the coming days, Judge Mitchell's actions would be investigated, and Andrea knew that things were about to get even more intense. But she also knew that she had ignited a spark, one that could lead to real change, one that would have an impact beyond her career or this single case. It was about accountability, about ensuring that those in positions of power could no longer operate with impunity. Andrea's path was no longer just hers. It was a path for the countless others who had been silenced by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. She had taken the first step toward making those systems more just, and she was prepared for whatever came next. The weeks that followed Andrea's press conference were a whirlwind of tension, scrutiny, and unexpected alliances. The legal world, once so tightly knit and impenetrable, was now fractured into opposing camps. Some rallied behind Andrea, hailing her as a pioneer who had the courage to confront a broken system. Others, particularly the more conservative factions, were less sympathetic, accusing her of attempting to undermine the entire judiciary for personal gain. The national spotlight had intensified the scrutiny on Judge Mitchell, and investigations into his conduct were launched by both the state's Judicial Review Board and independent organizations calling for transparency and accountability. Despite the increasing pressure, Andrea remained steadfast. She continued to meet with her legal team and carefully monitored the ongoing investigations. Every word she spoke, every action she took, was now a matter of public record. The risk was immense, but Andrea had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And right now, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Andrea knew that this fight was no longer just about one judge, one fine, or even her own personal experience. It was about a larger shift, about ensuring that the legal system was held accountable for its biases, that the voices of marginalized communities would no longer be overlooked. In this moment, Andrea became not just a symbol, but a catalyst for change. During a quiet evening at her office, Andrea received a phone call that would prove to be a turning point in the case. It was from a high-ranking member of the state's Bar Association, someone who had once been a vocal critic of her actions. "Andrea," the voice on the other end said, "I want you to know that we're reviewing the information you've provided, and we're taking steps to ensure that this issue is addressed." The call was brief, but it was enough to reassure Andrea that her efforts were being taken seriously. The acknowledgement from within the system gave her a renewed sense of hope. If this fight could push even some of the most powerful figures in the legal world to re-examine their views, perhaps it could spark a broader movement. As the investigation into Judge Mitchell continued, more damning evidence came to light. Reports from previous cases involving the judge revealed a pattern of inconsistencies and rulings that disproportionately affected people of color and women. The pressure on Judge Mitchell mounted, and in a stunning move, the judge announced his resignation, citing the ongoing investigation as his reason for stepping down. The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community, but Andrea knew that it was only a small victory in the grand scheme of things. In the days that followed, Andrea reflected on the significance of what had transpired. Her decision to stand up had resulted in tangible change. The resignation of a judge was a rare event, but it was just the beginning. The legal community, as well as the public at large, were now engaged in a broader conversation about systemic racism, biases in the judiciary, and the need for reform. But Andrea also understood that the work wasn't over. While the resignation was a major victory, it was only one step in a much larger journey. There would be more fights, more battles, and more challenges ahead. She would continue to push for more comprehensive changes to the legal system, changes that would ensure fairness for all, regardless of race, gender, or background. As she walked out of her office one evening, Andrea looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of everything she had accomplished. She knew that her actions had sparked a conversation that could lead to lasting change. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been without sacrifice. But for Andrea, the fight had always been worth it. Because in the end, she knew that change wasn't just about one person. It was about creating a system that worked for everyone, and she was proud to have played a role in shaping that future.